It appears that Russia's special military operations in Ukraine may be about to come to an end and be replaced by an official declaration of war on Ukraine from Russia. This seems to be the most likely scenario now that several of the Ukrainian areas occupied by Russia have announced that they will hold referendums on whether or not to fully join and thus become a part of the Russian Federation. The occupied regions, or oblasts, that are asking for this referendum are Kherson, Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, and Luhansk. These referendums are currently slated to be held on the 23rd of September and last until the 27th. I hardly need to tell you this, but these occupied regions are of course run by de facto local Russian puppet governments. One of the heads of these administrations is Volodymyr Saldo here, who is announcing the referendum and saying that he has been assured it will not take long for the President of Russia, based on the results on the referendum, to ensure that it is enshrined into Russian law and therefore the regions will officially be joined into the Russian Federation. This is almost certainly not something that the local governmental heads have come up with on their own, especially as previously a referendum rumored to be taking place in the Kherson region was cancelled over what appeared at the time to be fears over a successful Ukrainian counterattack that might have been able to push into the region. That attack has since been halted, although there is a currently ongoing, slow but deliberate offensive in the area. This in turn, of course, then raises the question, why now? Why suddenly did all four of these regions decide to hold a referendum at the same time to join with Russia? Well, the answer to that is, of course, that somebody told them to. But why were they told to now, if previously it was considered a little bit too risky and might open Russia up to a public humiliation if Kherson fell back into Ukrainian hands? Is it now not an even bigger risk to take, as the Ukrainian army appears to be in the ascendancy, even as the Russian army appears to be fragmenting before them? I would speculate that it is precisely because of that the referendum must be now. Before this, the fear was that Russia would be humiliated if territory they had taken was lost. Well, that fear has already come to pass. Russia has already been humiliated. Zelensky's position has already been strengthened, and Europe and the US are once again rallying behind him to provide fresh arms, training, and equipment because they see success on the battlefield. Thus, with the fear already having come to pass, one is left to deal with the realities of the current situation. If it is, as it appears, that the Russian army is growing significantly weaker before a slowing, yet still continuing Ukrainian offensive, then referendums in these areas, which would in turn officially make them parts of Russia, would open up a whole range of new options for President Putin. The biggest of which, of course, is, like I started this video with, that the special military operations in Ukraine will be at an end, whereas war will commence. In the short-term, immediate, on-the-ground reality, this is a distinction without a difference. But legally and strategically speaking, it is potentially a major difference. Now, I have previously spoken a bit about the idea of mobilization in Russia in a previous video, when a rumor was going around that Putin might declare war on Ukraine during the Victory Day celebrations. He ended up not doing so, however, and the situation has changed so drastically that most of the takes from back then do not necessarily apply anymore, although the basic ideas of Russian law and how it governs a mobilization are still there. So briefly, I will explain. Russia has 3 types of soldiers: conscript soldiers, reserve soldiers, and contract soldiers. Conscript soldiers are those conscripted for military service. These soldiers cannot, by Russian law, be deployed outside of Russia's borders. Now again, in reality, this was a restriction that was often circumvented via various tricks and or outright threats on occasion, but now you can see one of the reasons why they might want these regions of Ukraine to become official parts of Russia. Because now that they are, as far as the Russian state is concerned, Russia, well, conscript soldiers can be dispatched without violating the law. This would also allow for the deployment of the reserve soldiers. Now, a reserve soldier in Russia is simply someone who has conducted military service at any point previously and is younger than 42 years old. And the final type of soldier, the contract soldier, is the soldier that has volunteered for military service and signed a contract for a fixed duration, 1, 2, or 3 years. These are normally the only types of soldiers that can be sent outside of Russia's borders legally. But again, that border part is the important one. Because if these regions become a part of Russia, then Russia may also legally mobilize its army for war because it has been invaded. Never mind that it was Russia that moved its borders onto foreign soil. As far as the Russian state is concerned, this is Russian soil, the enemy is on it, therefore it is an invasion. The question then is a mobilization likely? Well, if the referendums go through and are joined with Russia, then I would say it is almost unavoidable. Russia is currently losing on the battlefield, and that is not going to change without some pretty major redress of the current balance of power. Furthermore, there have been some interesting movement recently inside of the Russian state apparatus. For example, a series of changes to laws to mobilization, martial law, and wartime measures to be added to the criminal code, including increased jail sentences for those who refuse to serve in the military, and also increased jail sentences for anyone who might be missing from the military, whether captured or otherwise. For example, if somebody is away from their unit for more than a month, that can now be punished from 5 to 10 years in a colony. Which is quite the term. But it does sound a lot better than Gulag, I do suppose. There is also a lot of rumors going around that Russia might make it illegal for people who might be in the recruitment brackets to leave the country very, very soon. But assuming it is going to happen, what does it mean? Now, a Russian mobilization means a couple of things. First and most obviously, it is the unlocking of manpower reserves. For example, conscription can be extended to every single eligible person, which means every male between the ages of 18 to 27, with some 1.2 million Russian men coming of age every year. That is a potentially enormous number. And added onto that are all of those who are fit for service. This includes previously non-conscripted personnel and those who have been a member of the armed forces previously and are therefore now in the reserve army. In grand total, this would be some 45+ million people. Obviously, this does not mean that mobilizing this number of soldiers is a realistic possibility. They need to be armed, they need to be clothed, they need to be trained, they need to be fed, etc., 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 etc. But I will point out that during the Second World War, over the course of it, the Red Army would conscript some 29.5 million men, in addition to the nearly 5 million men already in active service at the beginning of the war. Now, obviously, the Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union, and there are serious differences between them, especially economically, but Russia has in the past been able to mobilize ridiculous numbers of men, so it is far from impossible that they can do it again. Now, I will take a slight deviation here to talk a little bit about the Russian economy, because there are some points that needs to be understood here with the view of a mobilization potentially being on the horizon. I will simplify this quite a lot, first and foremost, because I am no economist and I couldn't explain the minutiae to you even if I tried, but I do understand the bigger picture. Back in the day of the Soviet Union, it was a closed economy. It was producing pretty much everything it needed within the borders of the Soviet Union. It was producing its own food, its own technology, its own vehicles, its own clothing, its own component parts for the military, the ammunition, the technology required, the tanks, the tracks, the armors, etc., etc., etc. Or otherwise, they were importing whatever little pieces of resources or technology they needed from outside world from nations so closely tied to the Soviet Union that they may as well have been a part of it. In this kind of a system, the Soviet state simply just says what it needs. If it needs 100,000 rifles, well, it simply makes that demand of its economy, and 100,000 rifles are delivered. Now, obviously, there are scaling up issues, there are construction issues, there is the establishment of the industry to be considered in the first place, but so long as it was within the borders of the Soviet Union and all of the necessary raw resources could be delivered, it really was so simple as the state saying, I need this, make it for me, and it would be done because they had the ability to do so. But today, the Russian state is a part of a global market. It exports and it imports like everybody else, and it is in particular reliant upon a great deal of imported technology. And to be allowed to engage in this market system, Russia is expected to play by the same rules as everybody else, meaning that Russia can't simply demand a thing, they have to pay for it. And if the market says that the Russian ruble isn't worth anything, then it isn't. And the import of whatever Russia might need becomes a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive, if possible at all. Now, obviously, there are many ways to game this system, as Vladimir Putin has done rather expertly during this conflict so far. But with ever mounting and ever widening sanctions, as well as the spectre of a crashing Russian economy on the horizon, access to even what Russia can still access will start drying up. Which means that Russia either needs to find alternative trade partners able to provide what they need, or they need to try and develop their own industry again. And that's not done quickly. For example, Russia could potentially develop the technology to make high-grade computer chips, which are used in, well, practically everything modern, but it'll take a long time. 5 to 10 years at least, and it'll be expensive and difficult. In fact, by saying 5 years, I'm actually underselling it, because the currently ongoing Russian plan to do just this has an optimistic goal of 2030. And again, today, everything needs microchips. of varying degrees of complexity, sizes, types, etc., but everything needs them. Computers, obviously, mining equipment, drilling and pumping equipment, which is producing the gas that Russia is using to blackmail Europe with, and particularly high-grade military equipment uses this by the bucket load. If Russia does not have the ability to replenish its stores, its ability to wage a modern war will simply cease. However, this brings us onto the second part of a mobilization, for it is not merely the mobilization of manpower, as important as that is, it also gives the Russian state wide and sweeping powers over the Russian industry. Perhaps what would take 10 or 8 years to achieve in a civilian industry could be achieved in half that time with a bit of governmental encouragement, shall we say. And when it comes to items that are easier to produce, like, say, for example, AKs, the Russian government could potentially force through enormous investments and expenditure of more conventional ammunition production to rapidly ramp up said production, to the point where arming those 40+ million people might not be such an impossibility after all. As the old man Joseph Stalin himself said, quantity has a quality all of its own. And the Russian army is apparently trying to beef up that quality right now, with fairly legitimate sounding rumors and video evidence appearing to show recruiting drives in prisons. Now, recruiting prisoners or offering military service as an alternative to prison is far from an unheard of thing, but it does display a certain degree of desperation, and specifically a desperation for more manpower right the hell now. A large-scale mobilization could provide that, even if it would come with damages to the economy. Now, the scale of the mobilization is also a big question. Originally, I would have argued that a fairly limited mobilization would be Russia's best option, beefing up the front line with reserve personnel to the point where it could not collapse quickly, and then waiting a year or so for a fresh crop of conscripts to be fully trained and outfitted, because sending raw recruits to the front line tends to end with rapidly rising casualty numbers, and Russia would be better served biding its time for a year and deploying actually combat-capable personnel. But that is assuming Russia has the time to do so, and judging by the situation right now, Russia may have judged that it doesn't. Which leads us to an interesting little question here. If we were in Vladimir Putin's shoes, we might now be placed in front of a crossroad with no good alternatives. On the one hand, these regions are asking to secede. They are asking to become a part of Russia. You are receiving threats from every single other world leader, with the exception of China, that doing so will have severe consequences. The United States in particular is very strident that if this happens, its aid to Ukraine will increase yet further. And with Europe desperately trying to rectify its incredible mistake of growing reliance upon Russian gas, Putin's bargaining chip vis-a-vis the Europeans is beginning to fade away as well. And in the face of a completely unified West's economic sanctions and ever-mounting military and economic support to Ukraine, it may very well place the war and its victory far outside of Russia's reach. It might also lead to enormous deprivations in Russian society, which could in turn lead to, well, what Russians usually do when stuff starts getting hard. This is obviously something Putin would like to avoid, as he is the current resident of the metaphorical Winter Palace. On the other hand, if he refuses to acknowledge these breakaway republics, these oblasts' demands to join the Russian Federation, his image as Russia's strongman leader is gone, and he is likely to be replaced by another leader, peacefully or otherwise, very, very quickly. Mr. Putin has found himself in a rather unenviable position where there does not seem to be any particularly good options, with the only real choice being to burn today or to burn tomorrow. Now, there are still some potential choices to be made and some scenarios to be played out. For example, Putin could choose to accept the areas into Russia and then simply say, well, if you're going to invade Russia, now you are an existential threat. If you watched some of my previous videos on this topic, you know what that means. In the Russian legal code, it says that nuclear weapons can only be used if Russia is facing an existential threat. And, well, again, an invasion of Russia, as its army is splintering, ignoring again that Russia's border has moved rather drastically in the enemy's direction, could therefore legally constitute an existential threat. Now, that is not to say that Russia would outright just nuke Ukraine. It would simply just say, hey, this is our legal basis. If you keep going, boom. And so we're going to have to negotiate. Now, Kiev has said that if any referendums are carried out, then any and all negotiations are off the table and impossible. This is bluster. Simple as. Ukraine right now is in a winning position, and it is going to play its hand high and tough. In the face of a potential nuclear strike, negotiation will be the only option. This will also earn Russia the enmity of, well, most of the globe, and leave it wholly reliant on China, its sole remaining theoretical ally. This might even reduce Russia through lack of trade and, again, being entirely reliant on Russia as little more than a satellite state of China. Because if China are the only ones willing to take their goods, China's the one setting the price, no matter how high that price might be. The second option, which is aiming to achieve much the same thing but in a different way, is full mobilization. Hell for leather. Throw everything at the wall. Mobilize literal millions as the economy goes on a full war footing. Arming them with whatever you can get your hands on, and bleeding Ukraine to the point where negotiation is the only option, whilst also placing enormous pressure on Europe. That pressure is what I talked about in a previous video, General Winter, where Russia simply just shuts off all gas exports and goes, okay, we're full economic war now, our economy is going to crash, we're not going to do it slow, we're going to go hard, and we're going to bring Germany down with us, which might very well cause massive civil upheaval in Europe. It may be enough to get Europe to start leaning on Zelensky to initiate peace talks. And militarily speaking, can Russia essentially overwhelm Ukraine? Theoretically, possibly. Maybe. It is difficult to say, but the Ukrainian army only consists of maybe 200,000 to 300,000 active, trained, and properly equipped military personnel. After months of fighting, that number is bound to be significantly lower, even with continuous reinforcements. In all due likelihood, right now, the Ukrainian army is not as tattered as the Russian, but it's definitely feeling the heat. In addition to this, you've got another 3 to maybe 400,000 reserve and paramilitary personnel, National Guard level forces. These are most of the time second and third line personnel, more than capable of guarding borders and keeping an eye on the vast non-actively fought for areas. But if Russia manages to mobilize enough men, and more importantly, manages to mobilize enough logistical support for them to simply launch massive invasions all across the Ukraine-Russia border and Belarus, somewhere there's gonna be weak forces. It is almost a guaranteed law of military science at that point. Even if Ukraine mobilized everything it possibly could, it's looking at maybe 5 to the most optimistic and extreme estimates, 10 million men. Presuming these can be armed, and presuming Ukraine doesn't care about the fact that it will paralyze its own economy, even then, Russia might enjoy an advantage of 2 to 3 to 4 to 1. Bearing in mind, again, these kind of mobilization numbers, we are actually talking about the death sentence for either country's economy. The stakes for the two combatants literally could not be higher right now. And Vladimir Putin's choice will, in all due likelihood, be to either back down completely or double down completely. Which one will he choose? Honestly, I'm not even sure. If I were to be forced to make a prediction, I am leaning towards the nuclear threat option, hoping that everything will back down, that everyone will be frightened yet again by yet another threat enough to cease operations. Now, the problem with that is Russia's entire propaganda apparatus up until this point has been built on nothing but threats, none of which has actually been carried out. And you know what they say about the boy who keeps crying wolf? Or, maybe most anticlimactically of all of this talk of referendums will simply disappear. Never be mentioned again, giving Putin plausible deniability that he was never behind any push for a referendum, of course, in which case the war will simply continue to grind on and on, perhaps in Ukraine's favor. We will have to wait and see in the next couple of days. I was actually waiting to make this video because Putin was supposed to speak on the day of recording, which by the time you're watching it should be yesterday, but the speech was cancelled, lending a certain degree of credibility to the previous speculation that maybe Putin decided to test the waters, send out the saying that there would be a referendum, and then judge the response. Maybe the response was too overwhelming, and so he decided to just kind of ignore it. The speech has apparently been postponed to today, by the time you're watching this, so we will see whether or not the strong man of Russia is willing to double down yet again. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.